do today, we're going to finish the Heckscher-Ohlin illustration in terms of empirical evidence, and then we'll look at another factor proportions model, the specific factors, which you will see is just can be interpreted as the short run of the Heckscher-Ohlin model. One of the things that you get from that short run model is that the gainers and the losers will not be quite the same as in this model, and you also get different results when it comes to equalization of factor prices. Yeah. So just to recap, so this Heckscher-Ohlin model, this version of 2 by 2 by 2, it just predicts that countries that have are similar in all respects, except that they have different endowments of the key factors of production. So in our examples, we went for land and labour, will tend to have lower relative prices in the goods that use their relatively intensive factor, abundant factor more intensively. So, for example, if food uses land more than labour in relative terms, then the price of food in home is going to be low. And so they will, of course, have an advantage in producing food. With trade, the prices are going to be equalised. The prices of the goods are going to be equalised. Logic, unless you have the same prices for the final products, people would always be willing to buy where it is the cheapest. So prices are equalised, and because prices are equalised, the prices of final products, what you end up by getting is this powerful result that factor prices will also be equalised. And this is because there's going to be this one-to-one relation, as I show you, between relative prices of final products and the factor prices, what we call the wage-rental ratio. Yeah? And so in the end, you get this powerful result, and it is really powerful. You don't need movements of factors across borders. Trade in goods, in final goods, will actually achieve the equalization of factor prices. Yeah. So thinking of migration, and we'll come back to this later on, this is really saying, well, of course, one possibility is to allow people to migrate to where wages are highest. The other one is to open borders completely, and under certain conditions, you will get equalisation of wages. So there's no longer any obvious reason why people in the poor country would want to move to the rich country. So a very powerful result. Of course, as I told you, and I will tell you again today, it's really not quite true, because there are several of the assumptions, in particular the idea that countries have access to the same technologies, which are simply not true. But that still does tell you that there's going to be a tendency or forces towards approximation of different wages, and as well as returns on other factors such as capital or land. Yeah, and so what I finished the lecture last week talking about introducing this historical example of factor price, the tendency towards factor price equalization from the 1840s until the early 20th century. And the reason behind that, as I was telling you, is that there was a very big decrease in the cost of transportation. Of course, inland, it was mainly due to the railways, so gigantic US. If you produce wheat in southern states and you need to send that to Europe, of course, it has to travel thousands of miles inland in the US, with a huge reduction in the cost of transportation inland. That made it a lot more economic to do. And likewise, there was a substantial decrease in the cost of transportation across the Atlantic. So the reduction in transportation costs was the thing that reduced the wedge between prices in these major major continents, and it led to substantial price and factor price equalization. So what we had, of course, is that some regions, in particular Europe, were labour abundant. I mean, if you look at the map, you'll see how the population density in Europe is very, very high compared to, of course, the US and Australia, or Canada, of course. So labour abundant regions, in the sense that lots of people per square kilometre, would have wanted to trade in and export the goods that use a lot of labour compared to land. And likewise, the countries that are land abundant, such as the New World, so the US, Canada, Australia, Latin America, would want to trade and export the goods that use land relatively intensively. And that's exactly what we got from that historical evidence. So the price of grain converged. Of course, there's always a difference in transportation costs. You still need to take into account that if I transport a grain thousands of miles across the Atlantic, of course it cannot cost quite the same in Washington, say, in the Washington state as it does in England. But the idea is that it will tend towards converging. And we got that, as well as the approximation in wages and returns on capital. So who won? The Labour won in Europe, the landowners lost in Europe, and exactly the other way around in the New World. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is to think about a bit beyond this idea that there are only two factors of production. So the first thing I tell you here is that, of course, this is quite flexible. The way you interpret the factors of production varies from application to application. Sometimes land can be seen as a form of capital. It's just one factor of production. Often we separate the two factors in between labour and all the rest, and we call it capital. So you still get exactly the same sort of predictions, and it's actually quite useful. The DR that we used for the rental price of land is also the typical letter we use for the return on capital. So the diagrams are all exactly the same, guys, except that rather than using T for terre, for land, you use K. Yeah? So you could, if you had a question in an exam where it did make sense to use labour and capital, just remember that you need to swap all those T's of the diagrams into two Ks. But of course, there are many other ways you can classify factors of production, and another one that is very that is obvious and we've been and is relevant, for example, when you think about world inequality, is classify just labour between low skill and high skilled labour. And what lies behind that low skill and high skill is really low education and high educational levels. So there's plenty of countries out there, unfortunately, where average educational attainment is still very, very low, 3, 4 years, 5 years on average, so people don't even finish on average primary school. In other countries, such as the UK, where educational attainment is 3 times that. So if you think about goods as being produced with a combination of, in an economy, GDP is being produced with a combination of low skill and high skilled labour, you can obviously see that there's a simple application here when it comes to inequality. The north is going to be high skilled labour abundant because people just receive on average much more education than in the south. The south is going to be low skilled labour abundant. So if we reduce trade barriers between north and south, so if you want the rich west or rich countries and poorer countries, what would happen? And our theory suggests, of course, that the differences in prices of goods would tend to reduce very, very substantially, and the fact of production that is being used relatively intensively in the exports of the North would benefit. Of course, that's the high-skilled people, so you would be exporting financial services, you would be exporting cars, you would be exporting high-tech stuff, and the other factor would lose. So the people with low educational attainment that would be classified as low skill lose because of the competition from the south. Yeah. So exactly the same application where rather than having home and abroad or rest of the world, you now have north and south, and the north is high-skilled labour abundant, and it is going to export goods that use high-skilled labour relatively intensively. So this has, of course, for those people that are against globalisation, this has been one of the candidates for an explanation for the great increase in inequality within countries. So as you know, inequality has been increasing in the US and the UK, many countries in the last 3 decades or so. What could be behind that? One obvious culprit, given the huge increase in trade that I showed you in the first lectures, is greater trade has meant that the low-skilled people of the north will have lost because what they used to do is now being done by the low-skilled people of the southern countries. Yeah? So the predictions definitely are that wages of high-skilled people would, the abundant fact in the north, would increase. The wages of low-skilled people would, in the north, would decrease. And of course, exactly the other way around in the south. Now, these two things have happened. So we're thinking about, remember, the theory is all in terms of relative wages. So it may well be that wages of low-skilled workers have not really decreased substantially in real terms. They have decreased by very little in the last 3 decades, 5% or so. But if you think that there is economic growth, even if it's just very moderate in our societies, 2%, if real wages of low-skilled people remain more or less stagnant over 30 years, whereas the real wages of high-skilled people carry on growing at 1 or 2%, the gap is just going to increase. So this looks in total agreement with the theory, so this prediction. The problem is that one has not happened. That is, the change in the change in the prices of final products that would explain this increase in inequality between high-skilled and low-skilled workers simply hasn't happened. It's not true that the prices of high-skilled intensive goods has decreased relative to the price of low-skilled intensive goods. If anything, the opposite has happened. Yeah. So Heckscher-Ohlin theory, can it help explaining the increase in inequality within countries? Only to some extent. So what are the other possible candidates? It's skill-intensive technological progress. So the idea is, what has been happening is that technology has been biased towards people with high skills, with high education. And so those that have low skills and low educational attainment, they simply cannot use those technologies. So the more educated people, we just keep on benefiting from these ever more sophisticated technologies, and that increases our productivity, which is then reflected on higher wages. But the low-skilled people, they're not benefiting from new technology to anything like the same extent. You know, so for example, if you think of the builders are still using pretty much the same technologies they've had for the last 30 years or so. I'm sure some of their tools are different and so on, but clearly, you know, all of these revolutions in computers, in internet and so on, it's totally irrelevant for them. That's not changing. That's really not changing their way of working in any significant way. Right, so a bit more of empirical evidence in favour of this sort of this theory is when we compare we look at the patterns of exports between countries such as the US and poor countries, in this case Bangladesh. And what